never let an ancient Roman kiss you unless you want to taste the pungent sting of fermented urine on their breath. If you were to time travel back to Rome 2,000 years ago and wanted a dazzling white smile to impress the local elite, your morning routine would involve gargling with human pee. It sounds like a disgusting prank, but for the citizens of the greatest empire on Earth, urine was the ultimate dental hygiene product and the secret to a Hollywood-worthy grin. But that is just the tip of a very gross, very weird iceberg. In the next few minutes, you are going to see things that will make your skin crawl. We are talking about shared butt sponges in public toilets that were never washed, people rushing into arenas to drink the warm blood of dying warriors as a cure for epilepsy, and noblewomen paying top dollar for the literal sweat and skin scrapings of gladiators to use as face cream. You will even see how they turned terrified pigs into screaming, flaming fireballs just to scare off war elephants. Strap in, because we are diving deep into the stinking, blood-soaked, and utterly bizarre reality of the Roman Empire. The Romans discovered that urine contains high levels of ammonia, which is a powerful, natural cleaning agent, capable of bleaching stains and making teeth sparkle. This obsession with pee was so intense that it became a government-regulated industry. Huge clay jars were placed on street corners for passers-by to relieve themselves. Once these jars were full, they were collected and sent to the fullery, the Roman version of a dry cleaner. Workers would stand in vats filled with dirty clothes and human urine, stomping on the garments for hours to get the grime out of those expensive white togas. This business was so profitable that Emperor Vespasian actually slapped a tax on it. When his son Titus complained that collecting money from liquid waste was beneath the dignity of the throne, Vespasian famously held a gold coin to his son's nose and declared that money does not smell. But do not hold your breath just yet, because the Roman bathroom experience gets significantly more horrifying when you look at what happened after the business was done. Picture yourself in a luxury public latrine in the heart of Rome. There were no stalls and no privacy. You would sit shoulder to shoulder with dozens of strangers on a long marble bench with holes carved into it. This was the social hub of the city, a place to discuss politics, close business deals, or catch up on the latest gossip while your body did its thing. But because toilet paper had not been invented yet, the Romans used a device called a zyospongium. This was, quite literally, a sea sponge tied to the end of a wooden stick. The catch? Every single person in that bathroom used the same sponge. When you were finished, you would grab the communal stick, wipe yourself, and then give it a quick rinse in a bucket of salt water or vinegar sitting at your feet for the next person to use. It was a playground for bacteria and parasites, yet the Romans considered it the pinnacle of civilized living. The lack of hygiene did not stop at the toilet. If you were a Roman citizen suffering from seizures or epilepsy, your doctor would not give you a pill. He would give you a front row seat to a murder. Roman physicians believed that the blood of a fallen gladiator was a potent life force that could purge evil spirits and cure diseases. The moment a gladiator was struck down in the arena, people suffering from epilepsy would rush onto the sand, desperate to gulp down the warm, frothing blood as it poured from the dying man's wounds. They would even pay the arena staff to cut out the gladiator's liver so they could eat it raw, hoping to absorb the courage and vitality of the warrior. To them, this was not a barbaric act of cannibalism, but a high-stakes spiritual medical treatment. The fanatical obsession with gladiators went even deeper than their blood. These muscular fighters were the K-pop idols of the ancient world, and Roman women were so hopelessly infatuated with them that they fueled a massive market for gladiator sweat. After a grueling match, attendants would use a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape the sweat, oil, and dead skin cells off the gladiator's body. This thick, smelly, gray sludge was then collected, bottled, and sold to wealthy noblewomen as a luxury cosmetic. These ladies would smear the gladiator juice all over their faces, believing it would give them a youthful glow and make them irresistibly attractive.
It probably smelled like a locker room in the middle of a heat wave, but for a Roman socialite, that was the scent of power, masculinity, and high status. Once they had finished their beauty routine of sweat and urine, the Roman elite would head off to banquets that lasted for days. There is a very famous legend about a room called a vomitorium. Most people believe that Romans were so greedy that they would eat until they were stuffed, run into a special room to throw it all up, and then return to the table to keep eating. This is actually a massive linguistic misunderstanding. In Latin, a vomitorium was actually the name for the wide exits in theaters and arenas that allowed crowds to spew out quickly like a flood of water. While the room itself did not exist for that purpose, the gluttony was very real. Romans would feast on bizarre delicacies, flamingo tongues, parrot brains, and dormice that were fattened up in special clay jars. Throwing up right at the table was not considered rude. It was a way for a host to show off how much expensive food he could afford to waste. But all this luxury and strange dining was only possible because of the terrifying power of the Roman army. When you think of Roman warfare, you think of shields and spears, but you probably never imagined a squad of screaming, flaming pigs. When you think of Roman warfare, you probably imagine disciplined legions in shiny armor, perfectly timed shield walls, and the cold efficiency of the gladius. But the Roman military had a side that was significantly more chaotic, and frankly, smelled a lot like a backyard barbecue gone horribly wrong. Enter the flaming pigs. In the ancient world, the war elephant was the equivalent of a heavy tank. These multi-ton beasts could crush infantry, shatter morale, and were notoriously difficult to stop. However, the Romans discovered that these gray giants had one very specific and very relatable weakness. They were absolutely terrified of the high-pitched, ear-piercing squeals of pigs. To exploit this, Roman engineers didn't just bring pigs to the battlefield, they turned them into screaming, living incendiary weapons. They would douse the poor animals in combustible pitch or crude oil, light them on fire, and drive them toward the enemy's elephant line. The sight and sound of a dozen flaming, shrieking hogs charging through the dust was enough to send the elephants into a blind panic. Instead of trampling the Romans, the elephants would turn around and stampede through their own ranks, crushing their handlers and ruining the enemy's formation. It was a tactic that was as effective as it was undeniably cruel, proving that in the quest for world domination, the Romans were willing to commit just about any atrocity, even if it meant turning a farm animal into a literal fireball. But the smell of burning bacon on the battlefield was nothing compared to the slow, invisible poison that was quietly creeping through the veins of every man, woman, and child in the empire. If you look at the history of Roman emperors, you see a lot of erratic behavior, extreme paranoia, and what we might call clinical insanity. While power certainly corrupts, many historians believe the Romans were also being driven mad by their own plumbing. They loved lead. It was the wonder material of the ancient world. They used it for their massive network of water pipes, which brought fresh water into their homes and public baths. But they didn't stop at plumbing. The Romans had a massive sweet tooth, and they discovered that if you boiled unfermented grape juice in lead pots, the lead would leach out and create an incredibly sweet syrup called sapa. They put this lead-laced syrup in everything, especially their wine, to enhance the flavor and preserve it. Essentially, the ruling class was consuming a heavy metal cocktail every single day. Lead poisoning leads to irritability, memory loss, and cognitive decline, which might explain why so many Roman leaders made decisions that seem completely unhinged to us today. Imagine an entire government trying to manage a global empire while their brains were slowly being turned into mush by their favorite vintage of wine. When your brain is being melted by lead, you tend to make some pretty weird decisions, and no one in Roman history was weirder than the young emperor Caligula. He wasn't just a tyrant, he was a performance artist of absolute power and total insanity. Caligula had a favorite horse named Incitatus, and he treated this animal better than most of his subjects. The horse lived in a stable made of solid marble, slept under purple blankets, which were the most expensive fabric in the world, and wore a collar encrusted with precious jewels. But Caligula's ultimate power move was his plan to appoint Incitatus to the position of consul, the highest political office in the Roman government. Most people think he did this because he was truly crazy, but modern historians suggest it might have been the ultimate insult to the Roman Senate. By threatening to make a horse a consul, Caligula was telling the most powerful politicians in the world that their jobs were so meaningless and they were so incompetent that an animal could do their work just as well as they could. It was the ancient version of a political middle finger, backed by the absolute authority of a man who thought he was a living god. While Caligula was busy pampering his horse and insulting his government, the Roman legal system was dreaming up ways to make sure you never, ever thought about murdering your parents. The Romans took family hierarchy very seriously, and the crime of parricide, or killing a parent, was met with a punishment so bizarre and terrifying it sounds like something out of a horror movie. It was called the poena culae, or the penalty of the sack. If you were convicted of killing your father, you weren't just given a quick execution. First, you were severely beaten with blood-red rods. Then, you were sewn into a heavy leather sack, but you weren't alone. Inside that bag, the authorities would also stuff a live dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a viper. Once the bag was sealed tight, with you and 4 very angry, terrified animals inside, the whole mess was thrown into the sea or a nearby river. The idea was to deny the criminal any contact with the elements of nature. You weren't allowed to touch the air, the earth, or the water directly. You were trapped in a dark, drowning chaos of claws and fangs, suffering a death that was meant to be as lonely and traumatic as possible. It was a symbolic way of saying that by killing the person who gave you life, you had forfeited your right to be treated like a human being. Being trapped in a bag with a snake is a nightmare, but for the Roman elite, the real nightmare was not having the right shade of purple to show off at the theater. If you walked through the streets of Rome and saw someone wearing a deep, vibrant purple toga, you knew you were looking at someone with immense power and even more money. But that prestigious color, known as Tyrian purple, had a dark and incredibly smelly secret. It wasn't made from berries or minerals. It was made from the mucus of thousands of tiny sea snails called murex. To produce just 1 gram of the dye, you had to crack open and harvest the slime from nearly 10,000 snails. The process was disgusting. The snail guts were left to rot in massive vats in the sun for weeks, creating a stench so foul and overwhelming that the law required dye factories to be built far outside the city limits. If you were a high-ranking official wearing a purple robe, you were literally draped in the concentrated essence of rotting sea creatures. People could probably smell you coming from a block away, but in Roman society, that stench was the smell of success. It was the ultimate flex, because everyone knew exactly how many thousands of snails had to die, and how much money had to be spent just to make your clothes that specific, stinky shade of violet. The smell of rotting snails was the price of power for men, but for the women guarding the spiritual heart of Rome, the price of a mistake was much, much higher. The Vestal virgins were the most important women in the city, tasked with a single high-stakes job, keeping the sacred fire of the goddess Vesta burning in her temple. The Romans believed that if this fire ever went out, the empire would face a catastrophic disaster.
Because their job was so vital, the Vestals were given incredible privileges that other women could only dream of, like owning property and having front-row seats at the games. However, these perks came with a strict condition: absolute chastity for 30 years. If a Vestal virgin was found to have broken her vow, the Romans faced a dilemma because their blood was considered too sacred to be spilled in a traditional execution. So, they came up with a loophole that was far more psychological and terrifying.
The accused woman would be led to a small underground chamber that contained a bed, a lamp, and a tiny bit of bread and water. She would be forced inside, and the entrance would be sealed over with earth, essentially burying her alive. The Romans didn't call it an execution, they called it an unburial, claiming they were simply letting the gods decide her fate. If she was truly innocent, they reasoned, the goddess Vesta would save her. Unsurprisingly, the goddess never did. But as grim as the fate of a Vestal virgin was, the average Roman lived in a world where death was always just one bad decision or one accidental fire away. Life in the city was a constant struggle for space, and the way the poor lived would make a modern slum look like a five-star hotel. If you thought being buried alive for losing your virginity was the peak of Roman drama, you clearly haven't heard about the dinner parties thrown by the teenage emperor Elagabalus. Imagine you are invited to a lavish banquet at the imperial palace. The wine is flowing, the food is exotic, and the atmosphere is electric. Suddenly, the ceiling panels above you swing open and a literal blizzard of rose petals begins to fall. At first, it is beautiful, fragrant, and incredibly romantic, but the petals don't stop falling. They keep coming and coming until the room is waist-deep in flowers. What started as a whimsical gesture turns into a claustrophobic nightmare. Guests are struggling to breathe, and before they can claw their way to an exit, they are smothered to death by the sheer weight and volume of the blossoms. Elagabalus allegedly sat on his throne, watching with a bored expression as his friends suffocated under a mountain of perfume. It was the ultimate death by aesthetic. This emperor was famous for his cruel pranks, like seating guests on inflatable cushions that would suddenly deflate, leaving them under the table with hungry lions, or serving fake food made of wood or wax while he feasted on the real deal in front of them. It just goes to show that in Rome, even an invitation to the hottest party in town could be a death warrant. But while the emperors were busy suffocating their friends with flowers, the average Roman was just trying not to burn to death in their own home. Most people in Rome didn't live in marble villas. They lived in cramped, rickety apartment buildings called insulae. These were the ancient world's version of high-rise slums built by greedy developers who used the cheapest timber and mud bricks possible. Because these buildings were so unstable and made of highly flammable materials, having a kitchen was essentially a death sentence. One tipped-over oil lamp or a stray spark from a cooking fire could incinerate an entire city block in minutes. This is why the Romans basically invented the concept of fast food. Instead of cooking at home, the urban poor flocked to places called thermopolia. These were street-side counters with large jars embedded in stone, serving hot stews, lentils, and wine mixed with spices. If you walked through the streets of Rome, you would see thousands of people standing around these stalls, grabbing a quick bite because their apartments were literal tinderboxes. It wasn't about convenience or being on the go. It was about basic survival in a city that was constantly on the verge of turning into a giant bonfire. And if you did get injured in one of those frequent fires or during a chaotic day at the chariot races, the medical treatment you received might actually make you wish you were still in the flames. The Romans had a very peculiar obsession with the healing powers of goat dung. Yes, you heard that correctly. According to the famous Roman author Pliny the Elder, the best way to treat a nasty wound or a scrape was to apply a bandage made of dried goat droppings mixed with vinegar. If you were feeling particularly hardcore, you could use fresh dung.
But it wasn't just for external use. The great Emperor Nero was said to be a huge fan of a specific energy drink made by boiling goat dung in vinegar until it dissolved into a pungent liquid. He drank this concoction to refresh himself after a long day of pretending to be a great chariot racer or an actor. The Romans believed that because goats ate specific herbs, their waste products concentrated the medicinal properties of those plants. It was the organic, all-natural supplement of the ancient world, though the smell alone was probably enough to wake someone from a coma. The quest for beauty in Rome was just as disgusting as the medicine. If you were a Roman woman and you started to notice a few gray hairs, you couldn't just pop down to the store for a box of dye. Instead, you had to turn to the world of invertebrates. One of the most popular methods for dyeing hair black involved a recipe that sounds like a witch's brew. You would take a handful of leeches and leave them to rot in a jar of red wine or vinegar for 60 days. Once the leeches had completely decomposed into a thick, black, stinking sludge, you would smear that mixture onto your hair and sit in the sun for hours. The goal was to let the pigment seep into your follicles. Not only did this smell like a literal sewer, but the chemicals produced during the decomposition process were often toxic. If black wasn't your color and you wanted to go blonde, you might use a mixture of goat fat and beechwood ash, which was so caustic it often caused the scalp to blister and the hair to fall out in clumps. It seems the pain is beauty mantra was taken very literally by the women of the empire. All this consumption, from the millions of jars of wine and olive oil to the constant demand for exotic products, created a massive garbage problem. But the Romans didn't have landfills like we do. They had Monte Testaccio. If you go to Rome today, you can see a hill that is nearly 115 feet high and has a circumference of half a mile. To a casual observer, it looks like a natural part of the landscape, covered in grass and trees. But if you dig just a few inches below the surface, you will find that the entire mountain is made of nothing but broken pottery. Specifically, it consists of an estimated 53 million amphorae, the ceramic jars used to transport olive oil. Because olive oil soaks into the clay and turns rancid, these jars couldn't be recycled or reused. So the Romans established a state-run recycling center where workers would carefully stack the broken shards to prevent the pile from collapsing. It is a monument to the sheer scale of Roman consumerism. They weren't just a civilization of thinkers and conquerors. They were a civilization of world-class litterers who built a literal mountain out of their own trash. Dealing with the hazards of Roman life, like the fires we talked about, also created opportunities for the most ruthless kind of capitalism. Enter Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome and the pioneer of the most unethical fire department in history. Crassus organized a private fire brigade of over 500 slaves. When a building caught fire, which happened almost daily, Crassus and his team would rush to the scene, but they wouldn't start pumping water right away. Instead, Crassus would stand in front of the burning building and offer to buy the property from the distraught owner for a tiny fraction of its actual value. If the owner refused, Crassus would just stand there and watch the building burn to the ground. If the owner caved in and sold the property, Crassus would order his slaves to put out the fire, and then he would renovate the building and rent it back to the original owner or someone else. He became the largest real estate mogul in Rome by quite literally profiting from people's worst nightmares. He was the ultimate fire sale specialist, proving that in Rome, if you had enough money, you could turn a disaster into a gold mine. But as much as the men like Crassus dominated the business world and the political stage, there was one place where women were starting to break the rules and step into the spotlight in a very violent way. You've heard of gladiators, but have you heard of the women who fought in the arena? When you think of the bloody sands of the Colosseum, you probably picture massive men with bulging muscles hacking each other to pieces. But the Roman appetite for spectacle was far more diverse and, in some ways, even more progressive than we give them credit for. Enter the gladiatrices, the female fighters of the Roman arena. While much rarer than their male counterparts, these women were the ultimate bad girls of antiquity. They didn't fight just for fun. They were highly trained professionals who fought for honor, fame, and cold, hard cash. Unlike the myths of Amazonian warriors, these were real women who donned armor and picked up swords to entertain the masses. Some were even daughters of high-ranking citizens who chose the arena over a boring life of domesticity.
The Roman authorities eventually banned women from fighting because it was seen as indecent. But before that happened, crowds would go absolutely wild for a match between two legendary fighters like Amazonia and Achillea. Imagine the scandal. Women fighting half-naked, showing off their strength in a society that expected them to stay home and spin wool. It was the ancient world's version of a forbidden sport, and it proved that the Romans were willing to break any social rule if it meant a better show. But if you think women fighting was a major disruption of the social order, just wait until you see what happened once a year when the slaves became the masters. Every December, the entire Roman Empire would descend into a state of government-sanctioned madness called Saturnalia. It was the blueprint for what we now know as Christmas, but with a lot more chaos and a lot fewer clothes. During this week-long festival, all the rules of society were thrown out the window. Gambling, which was usually illegal, was permitted in public. Business and courts were closed, and everyone wore colorful, informal clothing instead of the stiff, formal toga. But the most mind-bending part of Saturnalia was the role reversal between slaves and their owners. For a few days, slaves were allowed to sit at the head of the table while their masters served them food and wine. They could talk back to their owners without fear of punishment and act as if they were the elite. Of course, everyone knew it was just a temporary game, but it served as a vital pressure valve for a society built on the backs of millions of oppressed people. It was a time of drunken revelry, gift-giving, and general debauchery that made the rest of the year's strict hierarchy bearable. However, once the party was over and the slaves would turn to their chores, they still had to deal with the grit and grime of Roman life, and their method of getting clean was anything but relaxing. You might imagine a Roman bath as a serene place of relaxation, but the actual process of washing was more like an intense exfoliation session that would make a modern spa-goer scream in pain. The Romans didn't have soap as we know it. Instead, they would slather their bodies in olive oil, often infused with perfumes if they were wealthy. Once they were completely greased up like a Thanksgiving turkey, they didn't just rinse it off. They used a curved metal tool called a strigil to scrape the oil, sweat, and dirt off their skin. This wasn't a gentle process. You were essentially scraping off the top layer of your dead skin cells along with all the gunk. If you were rich, a slave would do this for you, working the metal blade over your muscles until you were clean. The public baths were the social heart of the city, where people would gossip, network, and exercise, but the hygiene was questionable at best. The water was rarely changed, and the heat created a perfect breeding ground for bacteria. People would go to the baths to cure illnesses, meaning you were often swimming in a soup of other people's germs and diseases. This obsession with the body and physical prowess was shared by everyone, including the unhinged leader in Roman history who took the idea of being a tough guy to a terrifying extreme. If you've seen the movie Gladiator, you know the character of Commodus, but the real-life emperor was far more deluded and dangerous than any Hollywood villain. Commodus truly believed he was the reincarnation of the mythical hero Hercules. He didn't just want to watch the games, he wanted to be the star. He would frequently enter the arena to fight as a gladiator, but the matches were completely rigged in his favor. While his opponents were given wooden swords or weapons that couldn't cut, Commodus used high-quality steel. He once, allegedly, killed an entire group of disabled citizens who were dressed up as monsters just so he could pretend he was slaying giants. He even charged the city of Rome an astronomical fee for every one of his appearances, nearly bankrupting the treasury to fuel his ego. He would walk around the palace wearing nothing but a lion skin and carrying a giant club, demanding that people treat him like a god.
His madness eventually got him strangled in his own bathtub by his wrestling partner, a fittingly violent end for a man who turned the empire into his own personal blood-soaked playground. But while the emperor was busy playing dress-up, Roman women were already rocking a fashion trend that we think of as modern.
If you think the bikini was invented in France in the 1940s, the Romans would like a word with you. Deep in the heart of Sicily, there is a villa with a mosaic that has stunned historians for decades. Known as the Bikini Girls, this 1700-year-old artwork depicts 10 young women engaged in various athletic activities like weightlifting, discus throwing, and ball games, all while wearing two-piece outfits that look exactly like modern bikinis. This wasn't beachwear for lounging, it was functional athletic gear. It shows that Roman women were much more physically active and had more freedom in certain social spheres than we often assume. They were out there training, competing, and showing off their athletic bodies in gear that wouldn't look out of place at a 21st century CrossFit gym. This mosaic shattered the image of the modest Roman woman hidden under layers of wool and silk, proving that the empire was full of surprises when it came to gender and fashion. But as much as they loved the human body, the Romans lived in constant fear of the gods, especially when the sky opened up with a bolt of lightning. To a Roman, a lightning strike wasn't just a weather event, it was a direct telegram from Jupiter, the king of the gods. If a bolt of lightning hit a specific spot, that ground was immediately declared bidental, a sacred and cursed place that had to be fenced off and never touched again. They would bury the remains of the lightning, which often just meant the scorched earth or whatever object was hit, in a ritualistic ceremony. But things got really weird when a person was struck. If you were hit by lightning and survived, you were seen as someone chosen by the gods, a living miracle with a direct connection to the divine. However, if the lightning killed you, your family was in for a rough time. It was strictly forbidden to lift the body of someone killed by lightning above the knees, and they couldn't be given a traditional cremation. The body had to be buried right where it fell, in a shallow grave, because to move it would be to defy the will of Jupiter. It was as if the god had claimed that person, and the living were not allowed to interfere with his prize. This mixture of awe and terror governed every aspect of their lives, right down to the food they ate, which was often flavored with a sauce so foul it would make a modern chef faint. If you think the smell of rotting snails for purple dye was bad, wait until you hear about the condiment the Romans put on literally everything they ate. Imagine a sauce so essential to daily life that it was produced in industrial-scale factories across the empire, yet its main ingredient was nothing more than fish guts left to liquefy in the sun. This was garum, the Roman version of ketchup or soy sauce, but with a scent that would probably be classified as a chemical weapon today. To make it, workers would take the intestines of fish, like mackerel or anchovies, pile them into large stone vats, and add massive amounts of salt. They would then leave these vats out in the scorching Mediterranean sun for months. As the fish innards decomposed and fermented, they broke down into a clear, amber-colored liquid that bubbled with a pungent, salty, and deeply savory aroma. The smell was so overwhelming that garum factories, much like the purple dye workshops, were legally banned from being located inside city limits. But despite the stench, the Romans were hopelessly addicted to it. They used it to season meat, vegetables, and even fruit. They even had different grades of garum, with the most expensive bottles costing the equivalent of thousands of dollars today. It was the ultimate flavor enhancer, providing that umami punch that their cuisine otherwise lacked. But even as they enjoyed their fermented fish sauce, the Romans were deeply concerned with how people behaved in public, especially when it came to the ultimate social event, a funeral. In Rome, a funeral wasn't just a private moment of grief, it was a theatrical production designed to show off the status of the deceased's family. And, like any good production, it needed performers. This led to the rise of professional mourners, women who were paid specifically to cry, wail, and act as if their hearts were breaking for a person they had never even met. These women would follow the funeral procession through the streets, screaming at the top of their lungs, and, in more extreme cases, literally scratching their own faces until they bled to show the depth of their sorrow. The more professional mourners a family could afford, the more important and beloved the deceased appeared to be. It became a bizarre arms race of artificial grief. Eventually, the government had to step in because things were getting out of hand. They passed laws specifically forbidding women from tearing their cheeks or wailing too loudly during funerals. The authorities felt that this exaggerated performative sorrow was becoming a public nuisance and a mockery of actual mourning. It was one of the few times in history where a government literally told its citizens that they were being too dramatic. But while the poor were being told how to cry, the rich were finding new ways to stay comfortable in their massive villas, inventing technology that we still use today. If you've ever enjoyed the luxury of a heated floor in a modern home, you can thank the Romans and their incredible engineering feat known as the hypocaust. In a world where most people were shivering in damp, drafty apartments, the Roman elite were walking around their villas in total comfort, even in the dead of winter. The hypocaust was an ingenious central heating system that worked by raising the floor of a building on a series of small brick pillars. A massive furnace located outside or in a basement would pump hot air and smoke into the empty space beneath the floor and through flues built into the walls. This turned the entire house into a giant radiator. The floors could get so hot that the residents had to wear special wooden sandals just to walk across the room without burning their feet. But as with most things in Rome, this luxury came with a high human cost. The furnaces had to be fed with wood and coal 24 hours a day, a backbreaking and dangerous task performed by slaves who lived in the dark, smoky, and suffocating crawl spaces beneath the house. While the master of the house enjoyed the warmth, the people providing it were often breathing in toxic fumes and living in a hellish underworld. This stark contrast between extreme luxury and total disregard for human life was a defining feature of the empire, and it extended even to the most vulnerable members of society. One of the darkest and most heartbreaking truths about the Roman Empire was the practice of infant exposure. In Roman law, the head of the household, known as the pater familias, had the absolute power of life and death over everyone in his family, including newborn babies. When a child was born, it was placed on the ground at the father's feet. If he picked the baby up, it was accepted into the family. If he turned away, the child was exposed. This meant the baby was taken to a specific location, often a local trash heap or a designated column in the marketplace, and simply abandoned. This wasn't always a death sentence, but the alternatives were often just as grim. Strangers would sometimes pick up these abandoned infants to raise them as slaves or to be used in the sex trade. The reasons for exposure ranged from poverty and the inability to afford another mouth to feed, to the child having a physical deformity, or simply because the father didn't want a daughter. It is a chilling reminder that, for all their grand architecture and complex laws, the Romans lived in a world where human life was often treated as a disposable commodity. Yet, on the very same streets where these tragedies occurred, the Romans were building the physical foundations of a civilization that would last for millennia. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a poetic exaggeration. It was a literal description of the most advanced transportation network the world had ever seen. Roman roads were engineering marvels, built with a level of precision and durability that puts modern asphalt to shame. They weren't just paths cleared through the woods, they were multi-layered structures designed to withstand the weight of entire legions and heavy supply wagons. A standard Roman road began with a deep trench filled with heavy stones for a solid foundation. This was followed by layers of gravel, sand, and crushed rock, all topped with carefully fitted paving stones that were angled slightly towards the sides to allow rainwater to drain off. They were built to be as straight as possible, cutting through mountains and bridging rivers with no regard for the difficulty of the terrain. Some of these roads were so well constructed that they are still in use today, 2,000 years later, having survived the collapse of the very empire that built them.
These roads were the arteries of the empire, allowing news, taxes, and armies to move with a speed that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the steam engine. They were the physical manifestation of Roman willpower, a grid of stone laid across the world to show that Rome was here to stay. But as strong as their roads were, and as vast as their power seemed, the empire wasn't invincible. Most people think of the fall of Rome as a single dramatic event, where barbarians smashed through the gates and everything turned to rubble overnight in the year 476. In reality, it was a slow, agonizing decline that lasted centuries. The empire had actually split into two halves long before the end. The Western Empire, centered in Rome, and the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople. While the West slowly crumbled under the weight of economic collapse, lead poisoning, political corruption, and constant invasions, the East continued to thrive for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. The people in Constantinople still called themselves Romans. They still practiced Roman law, and they still maintained the traditions of their ancestors long after the city of Rome itself had become a ghost of its former glory. The transition from the ancient world to the Middle Ages wasn't a sudden crash, but a long, complicated fading of one era into another. Rome didn't really die, it just changed its shape, leaving behind a legacy of blood, filth, and brilliance that still defines our world today. So, you think you've seen it all? You think you've got a handle on just how bizarre, brilliant, and downright disgusting the Roman Empire was? Well, before we close the history books on these sandal-wearing psychopaths, we need to talk about the things that were too weird for a regular category. These are the honorable mentions of Roman absurdity, the facts that prove that if there was a wrong way to do something, the Romans probably invented it, taxed it, and then turned it into a public spectacle. If you were walking through the streets of an ancient Roman city, you might notice something very peculiar dangling from the doorways of shops, the necks of small children, and even the wind chimes on people's porches. It wasn't a cross or a star. It was a giant winged phallus. To the Romans, the phallus, or fascinum, wasn't a symbol of pornography. It was the ultimate lucky charm. They believed that the sheer potency of the image could warn off the evil eye and protect people from bad luck. Imagine walking into a high-stakes business meeting today and seeing a bronzed winged member swinging from the ceiling to ensure the deal goes well. For a Roman, that was just sensible home security. They even had a god named Fascinus, who was essentially a giant divine phallus meant to protect the state. It just goes to show that their definition of decency was on a completely different planet than ours. But while they were obsessed with lucky charms, they were even more obsessed with the hair on their own bodies. In the Roman world, being a civilized man meant being as smooth as a marble statue. Having a lot of body hair, especially under your arms or on your legs, was seen as a sign of being a barbarian or someone who lacked self-discipline. This led to the painful daily ritual of plucking. If you went to the public baths, you wouldn't just hear the splashing of water, you'd hear the rhythmic, high-pitched screams of men getting their armpits plucked by professional hair pullers. Julius Caesar was famously obsessed with this, allegedly having his entire body plucked on a regular basis to maintain his image as the ultimate Roman aristocrat. They didn't have shaving cream, so they used pumice stones to sand their skin down, or caustic creams made of bat blood and vinegar that probably burned like 1,000 suns. It was a society where men spent more time worrying about their leg hair than most modern supermodels, all while they were busy conquering half the known world. But what happened if someone did you wrong in this hairless, phallus-obsessed society? If someone stole your favorite cloak or cheated you at a business deal, you didn't always go to the police, you went to the underworld. The Romans had a system of spiritual trolling called defectiones, or curse tablets. You would take a small, thin sheet of lead and scratch a message to the gods of the dead, asking them to do something horrible to your enemy. You might write, "May the person who stole my ring have their eyes wrought out," or "May the charioteer of the red team lose his balance and fall under the wheels."
Once the curse was written, you would roll up the lead, pierce it with a nail to fix the curse, and throw it into a well, or bury it in a grave. Thousands of these have been found across the empire, showing that the Romans were an incredibly petty people who spent their spare time wishing magical diarrhea upon their neighbors. And while they were busy cursing each other, they were also inventing the very first version of the daily news feed. Long before Twitter or newspapers, the Romans had the acta diurna, or daily acts. These were large stone or metal slabs posted in public places like the Forum that listed the latest news: who got married, who died, the results of the latest gladiator matches, and even the current price of grain. It was the ancient world's version of a status update. People would gather around to read the gossip and find out what the emperor was up to. It was a way of keeping a massive illiterate population connected to the heart of the empire, proving that the need for a 24-hour news cycle is a disease that humans have been suffering from for over 2,000 years. Finally, we have to look at the very calendar you use every single day. If you've ever wondered why the months of July and August have 31 days each, it's because of a Roman ego trip. July was named after Julius Caesar, and when his successor Augustus got his own month, he didn't want his month to be shorter than Julius's. So he stole a day from February and added it to August just to make sure they were equal. The Romans literally carved their names and their petty rivalries into the fabric of time itself. Every time you check the date, you are interacting with the legacy of a group of people who thought drinking gladiator blood was medicine, used urine to whiten their teeth, and built the most impressive civilization in history while smelling like fermented fish guts. The Roman Empire was a paradox. It was a place of breathtaking engineering and stomach-turning filth, of brilliant law and chaotic insanity, of incredible beauty and horrific cruelty. They gave us the foundations of our language, our laws, and our cities, but they also remind us that human beings are capable of being both gods and monsters at the exact same time. So the next time you use a flushing toilet or walk down a straight road, take a second to remember the Romans. Just maybe don't use their recipe for mouthwash.